you, Mrs. Brooke. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship in this important debate. And first of all, I'd like to start by congratulating the Honourable Member for Liverpool Riverside and her committee on choosing this particular inquiry. And I think it's very important that they did a great job in taking evidence and indeed had the wisdom, dare I say it, to visit Felixstowe as part of that, which is in my constituency. She will know that I have childhood memories of Liverpool. That's where I grew up, so the docks there are very familiar, and indeed they continue to transform themselves again and again, and it's good to see more shipping back there. I also wanted to thank my honourable friend from Lancaster and Fleetwood. He made a very good contribution. I think he's absolutely right to highlight the issue of small ports, and they need access too. And although these two particular ports are not in my constituency, they're certainly an important part of our economy in East Anglia, with Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft, in servicing offshore energy, as well as continuing to serve parts of them to serve the fishing industry, which is an important part of that particular coastal economy. I also want to thank the Honourable Member for Poplar and Limehouse. He was doing rather well when he was being generous to recognise government success and the work that's been undertaken. I can assure him, I'm sure the Minister will, that the government has got plenty of legislation to get on with. It seems to me that the opposition just doesn't want to vote against much of it, so it's good that we have some consensus there. But I would echo his thoughts on having a day in the main chamber, because as he's eloquently pointed out, that it is an important issue. But I'll be very open, Mrs. Brooke. I'm actually slightly surprised how few people are here today to debate this, and I think that's a bit of a shame. I know it's a Thursday, but nevertheless, it is an important thing and something that gets raised regularly by members who look after ports in their constituency. Anyway, Mrs. Brooke, on to the report, and I particularly want to focus on Felixstowe, so I hope that Mrs. Brooke, you'll allow me to go a little bit further than some of the recommendations that were discussed, but to raise some of the issues that I think are relevant to Felixstowe and the access to this, as has already been pointed out, the largest container port in the country and the second largest in Europe. There are various ways to get there: road, rail and sea, obviously. And I'm very grateful that I think the committee suggested in thinking of recommendations 3 and 4, talking about the public infrastructure. And I'm very pleased that the A14 did not get tolled in the end. That was good news, not only for the port of Felixstowe, but it was good news for wider businesses across all of Suffolk. But I also commend the government for continuing the road scheme, recognising that this, the bottlenecks up in Cambridgeshire, which, by the way, were often generated by the growth of Cambridge itself, as opposed to necessarily the growth of Felixstowe. We are all eagerly awaiting the next stage of consultation. I understand that will happen next month, and I'm sure that the Minister will continue to commit that there's not going to be a delay as a consequence of the tolling option being ruled out. But there are problems closer to home, as it were, and I wanted to raise the issue about resilience of the A14 much closer to Felixstowe, and that particularly revolves around the Orwell Bridge. Now, Mrs. Brooke, if you've never been to Ipswich, I have to say the Orwell Bridge is quite a dramatic bridge, and it's a very grand. However, at times it can end up being entirely closed, and this causes chaos for the poor residents of Ipswich as traffic gets rerouted. And although the port does its best to try and, with its booking system, to alert people in advance, there's no doubt that it can have huge problems. One of the things that the Honourable Member for Ipswich and I had a summit last year with the Highways Agency and the police. We were pleased to hear that the Highways Agency did have reasonable recovery facilities. There's a particularly notorious incident involving onions, which I won't go into great detail here. However, it meant that the road was closed for several hours, and then within a few minutes of it being reopened, there was another accident. So basically, everything ground to a halt that day, and unfortunately there are quite a lot of these issues that happen. Now, the Highways Agency has come up with some proposals to reduce speed limits in that particular area. I welcome that. I don't particularly welcome the average speed camera, because it's certainly true to say that these incidents tend to happen at peak times of day. But I do want to thank the Highways Agency. They've put a lot of work into this. I just want to always continue them to encourage them to continue to up their game. In terms of recovery, that is still can be an issue, but I want to commend them at least for the work that they do. They've also been rather good at putting addressing some of the road noise issues. I'm sure my constituents would like even more road quieting schemes and quieter services, and we will continue to press on their behalf. Now, there is one little bugbear, and I'm not going to get too tribal on this. The signs along the A14 came in at great cost of £70 million, and for quite a long time were not connected. But even now, I think it's a little frustrating locally that the Highways Agency doesn't necessarily allow local messages to be put up. It uses references which don't necessarily make sense to most drivers unless they are already hooked up via lorries. And I just hope we can get a little bit more responsive, I think, from the Highways Agency. If there are local messages which need to be put up, they need to be put up timely, and they shouldn't be constricted by unnecessary rules. So on the road side, delighted we've got the A14 without a toll, looking forward to it being ready before the end of this decade, but recognising that there are still resilience issues in the Ipswich area which do need attention, I believe, from the Department for Transport. Moving on to rail. Now, the Felixstowe to Nuneaton is an important rail line. I know the government's already recognised that, and that was referred to in the port with the DFT or Network Rail clearing the gauge higher up the track. And we've also, in the last week, had the Ipswich Court. Indeed, the Minister was in the Ipswich constituency. This is a project undertaken by Network Rail, which should save considerable amounts of time and in the future lead to considerably more freight trains being able to run smoothly through to Nuneaton and up to the Midlands. It was completed ahead of time, and I think a big well done to Richard Schofield and David Ward and all the people who worked on that particular project. But as for the actual link between Felixstowe and Ipswich itself, that continues to generate significantly more problems. Now, I won't get into detail about the Ely Junction and others. We know that the government and Network Rail have already committed to doing work higher up the line. Some time ago, the port, when it was expanding, and looking to expand further, as part of the Section 106, it did commit to dual the line. And I recognise that this is quite an expensive piece of investment and infrastructure, and the timeline on that has been delayed. But I will say this today, I know the port is looking to change that commitment and to instead put money into a loop solution, which has been devised by Network Rail. But I still think that we should be looking to have that section of the line dualled. It would really make a difference to local resilience, and also the people that suffer are the passengers, the passenger services on that line. And for a variety of reasons, it's been particularly bad recently, Mrs. Brooke. And I'm sure that if we got to the dualling of the line, is the gold standard. The proposal to have a series of loops, which won't be ready until 2017 anyway, is, I would say, silver or bronze solution to this. But I do genuinely believe that the continued growth of Felixstowe, we do need that dualling of the line. And at the same time, as the Minister may know, I've been pressing for electrification of the Felixstowe to Nuneaton line, and by starting with the Felixstowe to Ipswich, that would be a huge start with the dualling to try and do it at the same time, with both the government and the private sector, Hutchison Ports, playing their role together. And I think what that would do, Mrs. Brooke, would be, one, we know that some of the freight rail companies have no interest in electrification particularly, but we know that there is one particular firm, I won't get into naming and shaming as it were, but who is quite happy to have a lot more electrification, use electric locomotives. And that would do two things. It would, I think, be quieter, obviously.